Lost American, Unrestricted Warfare, the Persian Gulf War. I was in third grade when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Most third graders would probably not really care that much about some man in a faraway country invading another country. Not me. It wasn't because I was some genius. It was because my mom was a Navy nurse who served in the reserves. She'd be called up to active duty and sent to the Persian Gulf. She'd be gone for 6 months. Before my mom left, I think that I was like most other third graders around the country. I loved playing outside and playing with my friends, but I really loved playing Nintendo. The last game that my mom got me before she left was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Yet it would not be long before I started to hear phrases like the Nintendo War for the war that my mom went to. Saying all that, this part of Unrestricted Warfare talks all about the Gulf War. The authors state, the Gulf War is a war that shows what war can be like in an age of technological integration. With that, let's start. In 1979, Iran seized the U.S. Embassy in Iran. U.S. personnel were held for 444 days. The U.S. in this time never rallied all of its allies and sent a large chunk of its military to free the hostages. Yet, when Saddam invades Kuwait, it does that. The reason is why. Well, the authors argue it's because by taking over those oil fields, Saddam had the West by its throat. The U.S. and the West needed oil to survive. Saving face in regards to the Iranian hostage situation was not as important as survival. Because Iraq was seizing the Kuwaiti oil fields, the U.S. formed a massive alliance to stop Saddam. This alliance not only provided an almost guarantee that Saddam would be crushed, but that the war would have widespread support in the U.S. Americans would not be going to war alone. Over 110 countries supported the alliance in some way. The authors argue that one of the big things to come out of the formation of this alliance was that the fixed alliance system, which they argue started in 1879 between Germany and Austria-Hungary, was ending. Essentially, the Gulf War shifted alliances from being built on ideology to one being built on interest. The authors argue alliances will increasingly be pragmatic and unconstrained by any moral filters. This is the characteristic feature of modern alliances. After I read this section, I thought about the Iraq War in 2003. The alliance system there was made up of some of our traditional allies, but also a lot of new countries that may have had their own interest. France, one of our main allies, did not join our alliance in the Iraq War in 2003. One could argue that it was simply not in their interest, and the French public had a lot of moral issues about the war. One of the big things that comes out of this chapter is the military reorganization that occurred right before and after the Persian Gulf War. I will say that when I joined the Marine Corps, their logistics units were called the FSSG, Force Service Support Group. Yet, within a few years, that name was changed to the MLG, Marine Logistics Groups. There were some other reorganization that happened as well, but I won't cover that all here. One of the big changes that happened prior to the Gulf War was the passing of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986. This act was a huge change to the organization of the U.S. military. From what I've read about it over the years, before the passing of the act, a lot of the branches in the U.S. military had no real central commanding element. There was not one true individual who could report to the President and the Secretary of Defense to get things done. For example, the authors mention that during World War II, Roosevelt had to balance the two enormous personalities of Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, and during Vietnam, aircraft had to follow commands from 4 different headquarters. The act would give a lot more power to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and provide for communication directly from the President to the Secretary of Defense to a combatant commander. The service chiefs would become advisors to the President and the Secretary of Defense. The Gulf War would show how good this organization would be. General Powell, as a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would report directly to the President and the Secretary of Defense. And General Schwarzkopf would report to Powell and have absolute authority on how to use the units under his command in the Gulf, since he was a combatant commander. The authors state, its direct result was to reduce the levels of command, implementing true and trusted command and causing the old deeply rooted tree structure command structure system to start to evolve towards a network structure, and a side effect of this evolution was to enable more combat units to share first-time battlefield information. The authors then make it clear that a modern military must reorganize in modern warfare or risk becoming defeated. I believe it was in the early 1980s when the US military came up with something called the Air Land Battle Doctrine. The doctrine dealt with how the US military would deal with all the tanks if war ever broke out with the Warsaw Pact. The main idea is that there is close coordination between the land and air forces. The land units will attack the main elements of the enemy's front lines, acting as a maneuvering unit. Then the air units will go deep into enemy territory to attack the rear echelon units that feed those forward units. One would think that the US military would use this doctrine in the Gulf War to see how the doctrine would actually work in war instead of having it all be theoretical. Well, that really didn't happen. One day in the middle of third grade, after my mom had left for the Gulf War, I remember hearing that the Iraqis had surrendered. I'm not sure where I was exactly when I heard the news. I do know that I was shocked. The ground war had just started, and then the war was over. I bring this up because the Gulf War started with the air portion. The ground units did nothing for the first 43 days or so. The US and its allies bombed the Iraqis without having the ground units be the maneuvering element. Once they did start to move, the war was over within 100 hours. This was not how air-land doctrine was supposed to play out. However, the authors write that this may show that the battlefield in the air will be the decisive one. Despite the air units proving their purpose in the Gulf War, the authors argue that some units did drastically better than other air units. To start, they talk about how even though the carrier was the main unit that hit Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto still believed that the focus of naval warfare should be the battleship. Well, during the Gulf War, it turned out that helicopters were critical to the fight against Iraqi armor and mechanized units. Despite this, the authors talk about how no helicopter units ever fought alone. They are always attached to another unit. Not only that, but the authors state that after the war, funding for helicopters went down while funding to tanks went up. Like Admiral Yamamoto, the US didn't fully realize the importance of helicopters in battle. Now, a brief side note here. When I read this, my mind immediately went to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. I think that war demonstrated that the Stinger missile system is a fair match against a helicopter. Thus, it's understandable why the US always kept its helicopter units tied in with other units. I also believe that during the initial invasion of Iraq in the Second War, a lone Apache unit got hit hard at the ambush at Najaf. This ambush, I believe, is considered to be the only battle that the Iraqis won against US forces in the Second Iraq War. Thus, I'm not 100% certain that I agree with the authors that helicopters will be critical in the future of warfare. I started this talk mentioning that my mom was activated as a Navy nurse and sent to the Gulf War when I was in third grade. My father was a Vietnam veteran who constantly watched CNN. He watched it even before the war. The guy was like a serious news junkie. Anyways, I remember watching a lot of the images on TV of the media showing so much of the war. Media units were embedded in quite a few of our military units. A lot of the clips that we were watching were almost in real time. This has led to a situation which the authors argue that there's not a lot of true secret information left anymore. I think that in the modern war in Ukraine, this really demonstrates the author's point. With almost everyone having essentially a high-powered camera in hands, they can film something and then load it to YouTube or Twitter where people can see it almost instantly. Another slightly related example of this, again from Ukraine, comes from an article from the Financial Times entitled "Ordinary Ukrainians Wage War with Digital Tools," which talks about how Russian military vehicles were ID'd, targeted, and destroyed thanks to a 15-year-old boy. The boy used his personal drone to get the GPS coordinates of the convoy, who turned them over to his father, who gave them to the Ukrainian military, who could target the convoy with artillery. Another aspect of the media during the Gulf War was how they really went with the US version of events with Saddam, casting him as an evil dictator who had to go. Yes, I was young, but it would be years before I learned that Saddam had worked with the US just a few years earlier against Iran. I'll point out that the US supporting Saddam and then going against him goes back to their argument that I mentioned in slide 1. Modern alliances will be built on interest. In regards to media, the authors state, the impact of the media on warfare is becoming increasingly widespread and increasingly direct to the point where even major decisions by the president of a superpower such as this one involving the cessation of hostilities are to a very great extent rooted in the reaction to a single televised program. Which just now brings me to the end of this chapter. The authors argue that the Gulf War is not an example of future wars. Instead, it starts to show how information technology will change warfare.